In the last grounded reflection, I shared one of the first times I remember hearing my inner voice. I was in my 20s, sitting on a bench outside the supermarket where I worked, thinking there has to be more. But at the time I didn't listen. I heard the voice and I went back inside. For years, that voice continued to show up. It followed me through different jobs, relationships, and many seasons of my life. Sometimes it was quiet enough to ignore. Other times I would push it aside and convince myself that things were fine. Let's just keep going, make it work. Until one morning, that voice was no longer something I could ignore. And that became the hard stop. I wish I could truly explain what I felt the morning that I woke up. It wasn't the typical voice telling me that I needed to eat better, exercise more, or get up early. I had heard that voice plenty of times. This was something else. It felt like something inside me had finally had enough. This was the you need to stop fucking around moment. Not next week, not when timing was better, but now. I knew I could no longer keep living the same way and telling myself that somehow it's going to get better. The truth had become louder than the excuses. I had reached a level of exhaustion that sleep could not fix. It came from giving away too much of myself for too long. I had spent years putting other people's needs first, trying to fix things, keep things steady, avoiding conflict, and making sure that everyone else was okay. I had become disconnected from myself. It was a difficult thing to admit because once you tell yourself the truth, it becomes much harder to keep pretending. I think that's one reason that we avoid listening to ourselves. Deep down, we know that once we see something clearly, once we recognize something, we become responsible for what we do next. And I had avoided that a lot. I had many different ways of avoiding it. I didn't want to admit how much of myself I had been giving away. I didn't want to acknowledge how long I had been waiting for things to improve while refusing to change what I could control. But that morning, I knew I couldn't keep abandoning myself and calling it life. I needed to take an honest inventory, not of only what was happening around me, of the choices I was making within. What was I allowing? What was I tolerating? What had I been avoiding? What had I been calling responsibility when sometimes it was really fear? The fear of disappointing other people, the fear of conflict, the fear of being left behind, fear of admitting something I had tried so hard to make work was not working. I began to pay closer attention to the conversations I was a part of and how I felt afterward. Some interactions left me feel drained and more disconnected from myself. I wanted more meaningful conversations, to spend time with people who are asking themselves questions, growing, and looking honestly at their own lives. I also started thinking about what was I feeding my own mind? What was I watching? What was I listening to? What was I using to numb myself instead of paying attention to what I was feeling? Even things I once enjoyed began to feel different. I remember developing this aversion to violent or disturbing shows. There was a time in my life when my daughter and I watched movies about possession, like The Conjuring and Annabelle. Hell, I grew up watching horror movies and slasher movies, but now I don't watch them. Not because all of a sudden I decided that they were wrong, but because I didn't like how I felt afterwards. I didn't want those images lingering in my mind. They no longer supported who I was becoming. For a long time, I had dismissed a reaction like that. I would have told myself it's not a big deal, but in essence, it really was. I was beginning to recognize how everything I allowed into my life affected me. The conversations I stayed in, the environments I kept returning to, and the people I kept trying not to disappoint. The things I had consumed when I was trying to escape my own discomfort. All of that shit was shaping me. I began to understand that if I wanted a life, more authentic life, I had to stop feeding the version of myself that was only simply trying to survive. I needed places where I didn't have to shrink to belong. I needed conversations that challenged me to think and grow. I needed to stop ignoring the signals coming from within me simply because they might inconvenience someone else. That was not easy to admit. It means acknowledging that a relationship, job, or environment may be costing you more than you wanted to see. It means admitting that the way you had been living is no longer sustainable, even when you don't know what comes next. That realization also brought some guilt with it. Guilt for wanting something different, for needing space, for putting my own needs first. But I have since learned that guilt is not always proof that you're doing something wrong. Sometimes guilt appears because you are breaking an old survival pattern. That morning didn't solve everything for me. I didn't suddenly have this miraculous plan. I didn't know exactly what would happen next, but I had to stop pretending. I could no longer tell myself that everything was fine when I knew it wasn't, because I had spent decades repeating many of the same habits. I wanted them to change immediately. I was tired of this frigging reoccurring loop. So instead of going slow, I jumped right in. In some ways, I became extreme about it. I changed what I watched, what I listened to, who I spent time with, and which conversations I was willing to be a part of. I wanted those old patterns gone. And looking back, I understand why I reacted that way. When you finally recognize a pattern that's been running your life for decades, part of you wants to make up for lost time. You want to change right now. One of the lessons I've learned since then is that real change requires balance. It requires integration. Changing your life is not always about changing everything overnight, even when we want it to. It begins with one habit, the first honest conversation, one aligned decision, and one small action. When change becomes extreme, it can turn into another form of pressure. But when change is integrated over time, it becomes part of who you are. That was the beginning of a difficult change for me. It was the moment I stopped pretending I was fine. I started telling myself the truth. And looking back, I don't believe the hard stop came to punish me. I believe it came to wake me up. It showed me what I had been avoiding and reminded me that my life still belonged to me. Sometimes a difficult change begins before anyone else can see it. It begins in the quiet moment when you finally admit, this isn't working. This is not who I want to become. I need to choose differently. Now, mind you, not perfectly, not all at once, but honestly. And little by little, I became more aware of what gave me energy and what took it away. Certain conversations that no longer felt right, and some environments felt heavier than they once had. At the same time, I found myself drawn towards people and places where I could be more honest and more fully myself. That didn't mean that everyone else was wrong. It meant that I was finally paying attention to what was right for me. If the last reflection was about hearing the voice, this one is about reaching the hard stop. And here's what I now know. The hard stop often arrives after we have ignored the inner voice for too long. But even then, it is not too late. It is not too late to listen. It is not too late to tell yourself the truth. It is not too late to make one aligned decision that moves you towards a more authentic life. That morning, I didn't have all the answers, but I had one truth. Things had to change. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to stop pretending they didn't.